I'm really honored to be here to talk to you about some new research, some new thoughts and ideas that have been coming up. And it's the catalyst for this talk really emerged from a lot of conversations that I've been having over the last year throughout the industry. And so a theme that you may have noticed is specifically about the uncertainty and the emotional impact that the volatility in the market is having on developers and is having on the tech industry in general. And as a researcher, of course, I began to get very curious about this and about what kinds of coping mechanisms people were using. And here's some of what they had to say.
How am I feeling? It feels like now it's just a matter of time, and even though I was relieved I wasn't laid off, I got scared. I know there's more layoffs coming, and now I wake up every day wondering if today's my day to get cut.
I mean, honestly, I just want to be able to take a few consecutive days off at a time this summer without feeling like I'm totally screwing my team over or having to work twice as much before or after and not have everything fall totally behind on the project. Like, I know that it doesn't all rest on me and I trust my team, but I also just feel this huge responsibility that I'm letting them down if I'm not always there. And I can't keep that up forever. I know.
I do feel okay most of the time, but I've been spending time with my friends, like the friends that have also been laid off or are struggling with like anxiety. I know this is part of a larger cycle and it's supposed to end sometime soon, but unfortunately it's everywhere. Like everywhere I look, like LinkedIn, Twitter, most of the media, everyone's reporting it. And it kind of feels like it's affecting everyone everywhere almost.
So how many of you have heard other people say these things in the last year, or you felt something similar to what's been said here? Okay, that's a lot of hands. It's been a lot. It's been a big year. And the themes that come up time and time again really got me thinking about the parallels between the kinds of sustained emotional experiences or sustained stressful emotional experiences and how we cope with those, and the work that I typically do supporting sustained cognitively demanding work. And it turns out that there's some very promising and applicable models and methods that you can actually start using today from the cognitive systems engineering and the resilience engineering research. And so I'll share a little bit more about what those actually are as we dive a little bit deeper here. So cognitive systems engineering, I study the kinds of jobs where the thinking parts of the job really matter, because failure can happen really unexpectedly and it can have really serious and unintended consequences for the operations, be that a nuclear power plant or a space operation or an intensive care unit. And the work that people are doing in these domains where they're responsible for maintaining safe and productive operations has to do with things like watching for anomalous or unexpected events, adjusting in real time as things pop up, and then initiating a response if they recognize signs of failure or of performance degradation. And in these environments, these things happen really fast. And so they're managing multiple competing priorities, like being thorough, but also being efficient, and having to collaborate with both local actors as well as distant actors in a more distributed systems. So this kind of sounds a bit like DevOps, right? And in these kinds of worlds, almost unilaterally in worlds like DevOps, the kind of high value work, it involves a high degree of technological mediation. And so that is that we're using technology to increase speed and scale and accuracy and safety and geographic distribution and all other kinds of operational criteria. And this means that in our work as CSEs, we are designing for the joint cognitive system, the human and the machine team. And this team becomes more nuanced and much more important as we introduce automation and, of course, artificial intelligence. And so for the last 6 years, a lot of my work has been studying software engineering through this lens. And so when we start to think about when I start to think about the systems, it means that I am very interested in how these things operate and on the different ways that different kinds of stressors and in the external environment, like acutely stressful layoffs or uncertainty and consistent sort of change happening in the environment, has on the people that work within these systems. And so lately, I've realized that we're not actually appropriately accounting for the effects on the developer's emotional experience that it has on their well-being and their work performance. And so that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. And so before we go too much further, I want to make it clear that what we're going to talk about is some strategies for coping with stress and uncertainty, but a mental health crisis does require medical intervention. And so if you feel like the effects of the sustained stress is too much to handle, or you're not really sure how you're doing, please reach out to a mental health professional or a doctor for care. But what I hope to do today is to develop some new language and models to help it not get to the point of crisis and to help collectively manage stress on the job. And so what this means, I want to talk about how do we account for these intense emotional experiences of the last year using concepts of resilience engineering. And so this emotional experience, in the nerd speak, is the subjective perception of stimulus coupled with the physiological and behavioral response. And that has mental effects like anxiety, like shock, like disbelief, irritability, and physical effects like not being able to sleep and having headaches or pain. And research in psychology and in neuroscience has shown that emotion and cognitive performance are actually tightly coupled. And so we need these cognitive processes such as perception and the ability to focus attention to elicit emotional responses. And at the same time, our emotional responses and experiences influence and guide our cognition to help us adjust to those threats or those changes in the environment that we were talking about. So in other words, emotion really determines how we perceive our world, how we organize our memories, and how we make important decisions. And so emotion is actually inextricably linked to software engineering. And in these, when these pressures or these stresses exert too much force, we tend to get a state of emotional exhaustion where we have depleted resources that's caused by this accumulation. And there's a theory called conservation of resources, which is where as these sort of stressors and as these resources are depleted, people become more selective about where and how they're going to allocate their resources of time and energy. And so this means kind of mentally withdrawing from work and exerting less effort, which of course makes sense because you're trying to take care of yourself in the moment. But in doing so, you're also kind of further exacerbating the problems of stress and high workload because the work doesn't keep coming, even as people become less engaged. So instead, what I'm proposing is that we build into our system of work to make it okay to not be okay. And some of the ways that we can think about this is that if DevOps is about kind of these philosophies and practices that increase our ability to deliver services at high velocity and kind of remove these silos between development and operations, then DevOps, DevEmoOps should be about our ability to deliver those things to enable people to experience what we in cognitive systems engineering call performance variability, which is, of course, not being okay all of the time. And so Some of the ways that we think about this is relative to how do the systems, when we study these kind of in high consequence environments, one of the things we look at to assess resiliency is when an anomalous or unexpected event or a surprise happens, was there total loss of functionality, or was the system able to adapt and sustain some form of performance? We're kind of familiar with this in distributed systems, and so this is defined as either a collapse of performance or as graceful degradation or graceful extensibility. And so graceful degradation is then about how do we allow for, maintaining functionality after these disruptions or after this pressure and avoiding the catastrophic failure. And graceful extensibility then is this ability of that system to be able to extend its capacity, so to be able to enable new forms of performance despite the fact that these pressures might be exerted on the system. And so let's look at a couple of different models of visualizing this. And we could say in normal operating conditions, we see a relatively high level of sustained performance, and there's a distribution of this as things like, personal events like life or health concerns, conflict at work, or there could be more macro factors here, like there's a big product launch that's, occupying people's attention, or rumors of a new CEO, whatever it is. And so we see this normal kind of variability, but in a period that's characterized by a lot of uncertainty and stress, we're more likely to see this distributed more broadly. And so then we start to see patterns of collapse when there's significant events like layoffs, a pandemic, or scandals, or other kind of adverse events. And the system might struggle to recover or bounce back from those effects, which compounds that, the effects over time. And so another form that we could look at it from a visual sense is looking at graceful degradation. And so we might see a more slow decline, which offers this opportunity to sort of correct or to manage the outlying events. Graceful extensibility then, there might be catalysts for greater performance, an opportunity to revise operations in such a way that makes things better. And there's research into communities that have experienced a lot of natural disasters that suggests that under certain kinds of conditions, with certain kinds of supports, the community can actually benefit from these events because of the power of having to come together and to be supporting one another during periods of extreme stress. And so today what I want to focus on is 3 different ways to think about this. And so I want to give you some individual strategies for yourself to both identify and manage your own emotional capacity, and then offer an opportunity for your teams to be thinking more broadly about this, and finally challenge you to think about how do we scale this at an organizational level. So the first thing I want to talk about is identifying boundary conditions. And so what do we mean when we talk about boundary conditions? Have you ever found yourself saying something like, I have been pushed to my limit, or I am operating right on the edge with this, or I'm right up against the line here? So in these kinds of conditions, what people are describing, or what you are describing here, is your boundary conditions. This is the, this is the degree to which you are able to manage and to understand sort of like the circumstances that are happening. So this is kind of similar to like when you are on a hiking trail. Some areas that you're in, they're going to be really well mapped, and others, you might have traveled this trail along a lot of times, so there's good information about what the trail is like. There's clearly defined markers to sort of show where you are, and there's probably a lot of other people around who are going to tell you what's going to come next, or like what hazards that are around. But if there's a bear on the trail and you need to deviate, and you might find yourself wandering into unfamiliar terrain. So here it's not always clear what the hazards exist, or if you're going to be able to call for help, or if there's dangerous cliffs or instabilities ahead. And so it's less clear how we're going to perform under these kinds of conditions when we've never been in them, or when we are constantly in new and unfamiliar terrain. And so from an emotional perspective, I want to talk a little bit about a strategy, or about a model that a Danish researcher named Jens Rasmussen came up with to think about how do we consider operations in these boundary conditions. And so what Rasmussen said is that our actions are always bounded, and so we're always operating within this trade space. And so our boundaries are essentially time and money, and in my amended version here, our mental or emotional sort of capacity to cope with things. And so where the boundary lines sit for things like time and money are usually pretty clear. You run out of budget, or the project is late if you kind of cross those boundaries. But what Rasmussen calls the line of technical failure is less clear, and particularly when we think about it from an emotional perspective. But we can all certainly feel what it's like when we're pushed to this limit. And so in his model, we move around this trade space as a part of normal operations, and we do this in everyday normal life as well. We get pressures exerted from one way to another, we push back against those pressures, and we move across the boundary. And so what we can start to see is, like, as those pressures to do more with less, that pushes us towards the boundary of needing to cope with more at work. So we might be saving money or trying to ship a feature that's faster. And as we move closer towards that capacity boundary, we're drawing on those resources that we have, the emotional resources. And so we incur an emotional cost to be able to do this. And so feeling stress and uncertainty for a long period of time isn't healthy. So we've developed countermeasures and counterpressures to be able to do that, or to cope with that. And those are things like petting your dog. Those are things like, those are things like going for a walk with your friends, or getting enough sleep, or taking care of yourself. And so that pushes us away from that line of emotional failure, emotional capacity. And because operating really close to that boundary is quite uncomfortable, and often we don't know exactly where it is, we put in this little line of the sort of acceptable boundary to us. And so we kind of use this as a way to say, oh, I'm getting too close to the edge, to avoid the catastrophic failure of crossing that line. But here's the thing, is that when you are operating close to the boundaries, we see what resilience researcher says, David Wood says, is there be dragons. And so the constant pressure of operating in those boundary conditions means that we are less sensitive to what is going to potentially push us over the edge, and we're less likely to know the ways in which the system is going to fail. So if we can't take a day off, like that engineer said in the beginning, and we get overloaded and there's a lot of stress, people may start to act and react in very unpredictable ways. And so in cognitive systems engineering, we talk about this as being that operating in the margins makes the system brittle. It makes it less predictable. So to put a little bit of a finer point on this, for myself, when I'm operating in the boundary conditions, my dragons are that I start to lose keys. I start to forget appointments that I've made. I start to get a little bit irritated. I become a bit of a cranky pants. And then from the time and money perspective, I'm just always late with everything. I feel like I'm always behind. People start driving or walking or even talking a little too slow for me during those times. And with regards to money, I start to spend a lot more money buying coffee or eating out because that pressure is just so intense that I can't sort of take the steps that I would usually take to take care of myself. And so what this says for me as an individual is that I'm reaching a point of saturation. And so saturation, when we start to look at this, is when the demands when the demands being experienced are greater than the demands that we're able to handle. And so this time that's spent in this margin can be thought of with an example from a researcher called Dr. Richard Gassaway. And he talks about saturation as it relates to kind of major rainstorms. And so when the rain is really light or it's moderate, the ground's able to soak it up and water gets into the soil. But when the demands grow, and it keeps raining and raining and raining, the flow of water becomes greater than the soil can actually absorb, and no more rain gets in the ground. Instead, water runs off the land and causes destructive flooding. And so we can think about this as well with our sort of emotional capacity to cope with things. And so some of the strategies why it's important to be able to identify our boundary conditions and for us to be able to recognize, oh, I am pushing up against this boundary. I've put my coffee cup down, and I walked away from it and I completely forgot where it is. This is a signal to me that I'm operating in the boundary. And so it's important for us to be able to recognize those and say it really directly and clearly to our colleagues so that we can start to have different ways of coping when we're in the boundary, and we can start thinking about collapse versus graceful degradation versus extensibility. And so they're very different things, being able to sort of recognize things are going on and then being able to actually say that to other people, because it's hard. It's hard to say that we are kind of reaching our limit. And an example of this from a former colleague of mine is that, there were times when we were really pushing hard to, deliver a feature or something where he'd kind of say, I know we're going hard on this, but it's the end of the day and I'm kind of reaching my limit, I'm reaching my saturation point. Like, do we need to push this tonight or can we do it tomorrow morning? Because if there's an incident, I'm not going to be able to cope with it very effectively. And so what he's doing is he's not only seeing his boundary, but he's understanding the consequences of being in the boundary condition, but he's also sort of assessing the trade-offs of trying to push towards that boundary further, using his emotional state as well. And so this also, the other little thing that he was doing here was also normalizing it to be okay to not be okay, which is really important for sort of junior engineers and other folks within the organization. And that sustains performance a lot longer over time. And so when we think about other sort of dysfunctional patterns for coping with saturation, sorry, I shouldn't say they're dysfunctional, but they are patterns of coping with saturation that can become dysfunctional if we're not kind of communicating about what we're doing and why we're doing it, is things like dropping. So we just don't do the thing. We defer, we push it off in time, we degrade. So we do the thing, but we do it less well, and we delegate. We just kind of, can you do this for me? Can you do that for me? And these can be effective coping strategies for dealing with saturation if they're done early, if they're done often, and if we're able to kind of openly communicate about why we're doing it and what this means for our participation in the joint activity. There's also another anti-pattern that I see a lot of lately in tech, and that is to just dig in. That's to grit your teeth, drop your shoulder, and just push into what is going on. And that can be appropriate and that can be useful at certain points in time, but it also is not sustainable. And so how many of you would say you are droppers when things get pushed? Do you drop work? Okay, a couple of you. How many would say you're deferrers? You're just like later. Lots of deferrers. Okay, what about delegators? Not a lot of delegators. Okay, that one's a little bit harder if you don't have kind of formal authority. And what about degrading? You're just like, I'll just, good enough, satisficing, nice. Okay, all right. And then the question that I would ask for you is, are you the same at work that you are at home? And so what are some of the strategies that you might be using in your personal life that can help you at work or vice versa? And so in resilience engineering, we also look at, sorry, this doesn't really want to do this for me. There we go. So we can look at, like, we call this pattern when we're sort of like using these strategies, maybe locally adaptive, but globally maladaptive. And so we all kind of know, like, when we've got this pressure to deliver something by a deadline, we might use some of these strategies, but it's a system and everyone's interdependent and connected. So that demand that you're pushing off or you're dropping or you're degrading doesn't just disappear into thin air. You may have pushed it off to other parts of the system or transformed it into a different kind of demand for someone else. And so this can start to become an anti-pattern and sort of exacerbate some of the functions. And so I want to talk about this strategy that we see effectively in high-risk, high-consequence industries, which is about sharing adaptive capacity. And what I mean by sharing adaptive capacity is the ability to or what I mean by adaptive capacity is the ability to respond to unexpected surprises or events, anomalies. And so this is changing how the system currently works to be able to adapt. And so, for example, during the pandemic, when people were staying home and not traveling, some hotels ended up renting out their hotel rooms as remote work offices. Grocery stores offered, pickup services. Commercial airlines transitioned from flying people to flying cargo. And so, an example a little bit closer to home that I saw in tech comes from my dissertation research. And so a service owner with a large enterprise dev tools team was experiencing this massive company-wide outage over the weekend. And she was new to her role, and a manager who was, had a team with a dependent service, or a team that was dependent on her service, kind of noticed that she was struggling to get traction with her incident response. She's, been in channel trying to ping the vendor and trying to get attention on her ticket. And he kind of stepped in and said, okay, it's not a crisis right now, but I know that Asia Pacific region's going to come on, very shortly and start their work week. And, this is going to be a problem for my team at some point in time. So he reaches out and he offers to track down a senior engineer that he knows who's online and working on some other non-urgent stuff. And so she gratefully accepts it. And within a few minutes, they're kind of working together to solve the problem. And so this is kind of an example of saying, I have additional capacity and resources. I don't have to lend it to you, but in this circumstance, this helps us kind of achieve our broader organizational goals. And so when we think about kind of what not doing this, what not sharing adaptive capacity looks like, this is thinking about patterns of decompensation. And so patterns of decompensation, a sort of basic decompensation signature, describes how you kind of keep this system operating within target parameters. You have to exert a congruent level of effort. This makes a lot of sense, right? But as new forms of disturbances start to arise, that effort has to increase. And that effort eventually, at some point, will overpower the ability of the control effort. And so with adaptive capacity, what we can, and this can lead to collapse, right? When we have a drop off, so people kind of end up calling in sick to work, or they end up depleting their own resources, hitting their boundary conditions, and being unable to continue. And so, but with sharing adaptive capacity, of course, we can kind of redirect the resources from across the organization to be able to cope with unexpected surprises. And so what this is really matching the available resources to the changing demands in order to sort of generate what we call fitness for purpose in the environment. And so some of the forms of sharing adaptive capacity are really thinking about how do we identify boundary conditions for yourself or on your team, being sensitive to those signals of drift, and then calibrating. How much effort do I need to share and distribute for this? So a second, or a pattern that goes along with this, is about relaxing goals and constraints. And so relaxing goals and constraints are necessary to temporarily sort of redirect what you are trying to work on in order to achieve these overarching goals. And I'm gonna pop past this video here in the interest of time, but really it's about sort of thinking about what of these things that I'm trying to achieve are flexible and adaptable, and which of these things are hard constraints for us, and then thinking about how do we share that capacity across our teams. The second sort of pattern with this sharing of adaptive capacity has to do with reciprocity. And so with reciprocity, it is the quality of the act or of the process in which one person receives benefits from another and then provides an equivalent benefit. And so reciprocity, when we think about it in an I give you this, you give me that, transactional sense, what we're thinking about this from a systems perspective is look at this over time, and how do we start to think about sharing adaptive capacity relative to our changing demands. And so we can think about reciprocity as being cooperation, but just jacked. And so I saw a really good example of this in a dev guild meeting at a mid-sized international company that was experiencing a lot of really rapid growth. And an SRE manager was she was kind of discussing this investigation that she had done into her team's like interrupt-driven work. And that had just like substantially increased in recent months. And as she was presenting her findings, another manager realized, oh, wait a sec, the maintenance that I'd been deferring on what I thought was a low criticality legacy service was actually to blame for that. And so while his engineers were actually kind of focused on shoring up another one of his team services, he knew that he could reprioritize their workload and carry out the deferred maintenance. And so after this meeting, he kind of approached her and they worked out a plan that wouldn't totally derail his team's work, but would save her hours of frustration and save her team hours of frustration. And so the last thing I want to talk about is dynamic reconfiguration. And so dynamic reconfiguration, this is a bit of a challenge for the industry. And so this idea is about reorganizing across the system of work so that we can start thinking about demand and capacity regardless of existing structures or norms. And so I gave you some examples of this sort of like locally with individuals as well as kind of at a team level. But what would it look like if we started to consider dynamic reconfiguration across the industry and across organizational boundaries as well? And so what I mean by this is, a vendor, you have a critical service that you rely on, and they usually use a ticketing system, and as you are sort of, your team is experiencing, say, an outage, and you're trying to get urgent response to this, that vendor being able to think, it's not normal that I hop into a Zoom call and jump on and start debugging this with the team, but this is actually an existential crisis for this team. This represents, a real threat to this team. And so kind of thinking about, okay, how do I share my capacity with this client organization, even though it's not how we typically do work? And that's actually an example that I saw in working with a company as well, is these ideas of, hey, I recognize this is a threat, this is a risk to you, there's a huge impact for you within your organization, but I'm willing to kind of change the way things get done in order to meet our overarching goals. So what I want to think about is that I'm proposing then that DevEmoOps is about using the sort of signals that you see both within yourself, within your own work in your own life, and as well as within your teams to identify these boundary conditions and actually talking about them and talking about not being okay during conditions of a lot of stress and uncertainty. And it's also about sharing that adaptive capacity, thinking about how do we be better as a team, and then also dynamically reconfiguring. How do we rethink the way software gets delivered to be able to make work more tolerable and more accessible for others during periods of uncertainty and stress? So I'm curious, I'm around. I would love to hear an open space on this, and please keep in touch. Thank you very much.